education. So what is education? Well, it's the process by which people gain knowledge and how they develop their knowledge base. And what we want to understand about education is that throughout human history, a majority of our educational experiences have been informal. And what we mean by that is knowledge, information was typically passed on from one generation to the next by elders within a community, by elders within a family. But since the Industrial Revolution, education has developed a more formal approach, a more formal system. And essentially, what we find in the modern day education system is information or knowledge that a vast majority of educators believe is important to be shared with students throughout their development at the different grade levels. And think about what the education system looks like in the United States today. Perhaps you went to preschool, maybe TK, and think about the developmental skills that you developed in those early years. If it's learning to count numbers, if it's learning the colors or the different shapes. And think about how every year after that, new information is transmitted to you to strengthen your academic foundation. What we know about education is that it is linked to economic advancement. And I wanted to give a disclaimer here. Just because you get a bachelor degree does not necessarily mean you're going to be living this life a luxury. That's not the point of education. The point of education as it relates to the job market is to help you become a more attractive candidate, to become an employee with a strong academic foundation, so that when it comes to writing reports, your boss can have faith in you, that you can put sentences together to create a paragraph, to create a report. It's that idea of pursuing education to develop critical thinking skills, which are incredibly important when it comes to problem solving. And we hope that through the acquisition of a college degree, it will provide you that potential to earn more money. But once again, that depends on the field that you go into. So let's look at education from a global perspective. Most modern day political systems that exist throughout the world value and find value in the importance of universal education. They understand that if you're going to maintain a democracy, an informed public is essential. And so I want you to think about all the so-called developed, and I put that in quotations, nations throughout the world that identify as democracies. It is important to many of those nations that their general public has a basic foundation of mathematics, of whatever language they're speaking, and their ability to write and communicate in that language, and also of mathematics. Now, what we want to understand is that the educational institutions that exist today do connect in some ways to a job system by training individuals for specific types of work. For example, if you want to become a nurse, well, you have to go to nursing school. You want to become a medical doctor, you go to medical school. It's this idea that after completion of your nursing program or your medical school program, right, you have the opportunity to qualify and to potentially earn a higher salary. It becomes a more secure job path or career path. The community benefits from your knowledge and the information that you've acquired over the years. And think about how individuals became nurses, lawyers, doctors in the past. In the past, it was an apprenticeship program. Imagine being operated on a doctor today that didn't spend 5 to 10 years in medical school learning how to become a surgeon. All they did was witness individuals doing surgeries, and they learned from that experience. We can argue to a certain degree at times that knowing that this individual has mastered their craft, has the academic foundation for the field of surgery, for the field of medicine, provides a bit of ease for some of us. Now, we want to understand that at the K-12 level, kindergarten to 12th grade, and then we could throw TK and we could throw preschool in the mix as well. Those institutions have typically been under the control of the local and the state governments. Local school boards, for example, will follow guidelines established by the state in reference to what type of curriculum needs to be completed in order for an individual to qualify for a high school degree. In 1929, think about 1929 and the U.S. population in 1929, significantly smaller than the U.S. population today. But in 1929, we had approximately 248,000 public schools. Now, some of those schools may have had hundreds, if not thousands of students, and some of those schools may have only had 5 students. We see over the years a consolidation of public schools. So in 2016, which still holds true today, we see the school amount decrease from 248,000 in 1929 to 98,000 public schools. Now the question is why? Well, state standards have changed. School districts have been absorbed by larger school districts. The need to educate students on a rural farm, for example, is different today than it was 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago. Today, even students in rural communities have the ability to go to schools in more urban or larger school districts. Now, when we look at K-12 educational institutions, we want to understand that from the K through 8th level, there's approximately 66,758 schools. From the high school level, the 9th grade to 12th grade level, 24,000, so we see a significant decline. And then the private school level, and that could be K through 8th or 9th through 12th, you're looking at just over 34,500 schools in existence. And so we start to see that the American educational system is predominantly public schools. In fact, about 88% of the schools that exist today are public schools. And within those public school districts, we have what we call public charter schools. And we'll describe what that is a little later on. But public charter schools make up approximately 6% of the 88% of schools that identify as public. Private schools make up about 9%, and about 3% of American children, as of 2019, were being educated through a homeschool program. Now, I'm guessing because of everything that is going on in 2020, we are going to see a significant increase in the number of students who are officially identifying as homeschooled students. Now, what is a public charter school? A public charter school is a publicly funded school that's typically governed by a group or an organization, oftentimes a board of trustees or some type of board that has some form of legislative contract, aka a charter. And this charter can come from the local school district, another entity that may exist within the state, or the state itself. And the charter exempts the school from having to follow certain regulations, certain rules that have been created by the district. What we want to understand about public charter schools is that they offer a degree of flexibility, a degree of autonomy. And what we mean by that is that they're able to get innovative without having to go through a bureaucracy, a school district. Of course, they have set standards that they have to meet, but at the same time, if they want to, let's say, include academies, specializations for their students into their curriculum, they can. If they want to focus extensively on mathematics and science as they're building a STEM program, they have the ability to do so without paperwork being caught up within the district for many, many years. But what we want to understand about charter schools is that when they fill out their contract, when they write their charter, there are accountability standards that must be fulfilled. This idea that a school's charter should ideally, now whether or not it happens varies from district to district, but in theory, a school's charter needs to be reviewed periodically by the district, by the state, whoever awarded them that charter. And if they're not fulfilling the guidelines that they've established in reference to their accountability standards, then their charter should be revoked or could be revoked. Now, there's a lot of controversy right now over charter schools in the United States. In the city I live in, Montebello, there's a lot of debate over whether or not we should have charter schools. Now, I understand both sides of the argument. I myself personally are not opposed to charter schools. And when I say that, a lot of my colleagues, a lot of the individuals that I have within education throughout Los Angeles, they're shocked by that statement. I view charter schools as a response to the failures of the public education system, the traditional public education system. And let me give you an explanation why. Think about how many years public schools had to fix the problems that existed within their institutions. Some of us may know, perhaps by experience, that there are schools that are not performing well because you may not have strong leadership. You may not have dedicated teachers within the classroom. You may have a campus that is falling apart, that has been neglected for many years. You may have a school where you're lucky if 20, 30% of the students in high school graduate. We failed as educators, generations of students. And what public charter schools can do, if run correctly and if held accountable, is increase that high school graduation rate with a diploma that truly means that a student is college ready. And I'll describe what I mean a little later. Public charter schools were a response to a broken education system, to the frustrations of parents. I want to paint a picture for you. I'm not going to name the name, but I've been teaching dual enrollment classes, which mean um, classes that high school students take on their high school campus that award them college credit. And I've done it for multiple college districts. I've taught at probably 4 or 5 different high schools throughout my now 7 years of teaching at the college level. And I remember one particular high school. My class started at 3:15. So I show up around 2:45 and I park in the faculty parking lot as I'm waiting for school to let out. The bell rang at 3 o'clock. By 3:05, and I wish I can give you an official number, but just an estimate right now, I want to say 70 to 75% of the faculty members were gone within about a 5-minute period after the bell rang. And I was looking at this saying, well, I guess students here don't need any assistance after school. I guess there's no such thing as tutoring. I want you to think about that. See, people assume that their only obligations are from 8 a.m. till 3 p.m. But if you ask any strong educator, how many hours do you invest in a week? They'll tell you, teaching, or what I do in the evenings, or what I do on the weekends for curriculum development. So I want you to take that into consideration, that if we're going to save the traditional public education system for schools that are failing or underperforming, then we need to change the culture. Charter schools have done that to some degree. And it's not to say that every public charter school is great, because that's not simply true. And it's not to say that every public school is bad, because that's not true either. You're going to have a mixture of high-performing schools or good schools and a mixture of low-performing schools or bad schools. But public charter schools, many of them have implemented policies where teachers are required to do tutoring after school. It's part of their contract. Some schools I've seen where at the beginning of the semester, the teacher actually needs to go and schedule a meeting at the student's home. And that's very important, and here's why. You go visit the student's home, you get an idea of the student's background. Where's the student coming from? Does the student have a mattress to sleep on or a desk to work on? How many people are within that household? Does the student have a quiet learning environment where they can study and do their homework? Does the student have food to eat? All these factors will influence how a student performs. And so I want you to think about that. I think that's an incredibly powerful tool to enhance the knowledge, to enhance the connection between teacher and student and teacher and family. Now, it's not exclusive to only public charter schools, but that's where I've seen it take effect in an effective manner. So let's go back to the details on the PowerPoint. Between 2000 and 2017, the percentage of public charter schools increased from 2 to 7%. Essentially, we saw an increase from 2,000 public charter schools in the year 2000 to 7,000 public charter schools in the year 2017. We saw enrollment climb over a 16-year period from approximately 400,000 students to 3 million. And what we also find is that between 2005 to 2016, the number of students enrolled in traditional public schools decreased by approximately 600,000 students. So I want to ask you this question. Why do we see so much opposition to charter schools? And so I'm going to open up our discussion a bit. So let me stop sharing my screen. And I want to see your opinion on the matter. Perhaps you went to a public charter school. If anyone's willing and able to provide some insights as to why do you think there is so much opposition within school districts right now from teachers' unions to public charter schools being granted a charter, let alone be built. Any ideas as to why? And there's a variety of reasons, so there's not that one specific solution or one specific response to this question. But why do we see such high opposition within school districts to public charter schools? Well, let me share with you guys some of the reasons why. And once again, this is not all inclusive. One of the challenges with public charter schools is that individuals say, well, there's no accountability. Right? How do we know they're teaching exactly what the state mandates? Well, my response to that would be, well, they write this charter, they should be held accountable by the district. So we have to hold the district accountable for making sure that they're being assessed on a consistent basis. Another argument is that, well, they're not union. Their teachers are not union. Well, that holds true for many charter schools. But I want you to think about this. And without naming names, in the chat, I want to ask you a question. Have you ever been, any time in your K-12 experience, in a classroom where A, the teacher seemed to not want to be there, B, the teacher had a very foul attitude towards their students as if it was a burden to them to be there, or C, teachers who didn't want to teach? And all you have to write in the chat is yes or no. You don't have to give specific. But have you ever been in an educational experience where the teacher clearly didn't want to be there? And as I'm waiting for the chats to come in, I want you to think about this. And I'm seeing a lot of responses, and the vast majority are yes. Was that teacher who didn't want to be there, was that a new teacher? Or was that someone who had years of experience being in a classroom? Chances are that teacher was there for quite a while. And think how much damage a teacher can make by having a foul attitude. How much damage a teacher can have or make on wasting the time of their students. I'm going to share the story with you. Early in my career, when I worked in public education at the elementary level, I taught in Watts. And I had a master teacher, basically like a mentor, who was responsible for kind of guiding me on how to teach in elementary schools. And I would walk into this teacher's classroom for about a period or two a day to witness this master teacher, this teacher who's been teaching over 30 years, to see the magic she creates in her classroom. Well, she was creating, but she wasn't creating magic through lectures. She would sit at her desk, which was tucked away in the corner, and she was designing the home that she was planning to build in Texas. One day she would be ordering paint, the other day she would be ordering tile, and students were discouraged from approaching her. She'd basically just give them a worksheet. And for the entire year, and this was a fifth grade teacher, for the entire year, I never once saw her in the front of the classroom teaching. I never once saw her actively engaging students. She essentially gave them fourth grade worksheets to complete in fifth grade. Well, think of the disadvantage those students have. And the reason why I bring up this story is that although I am proud to be a member of the American Federation of Teachers Union, I was a former Teamster. I was a former member of the SEIU, so I do support unions. In traditional public education systems that are union-based, it is nearly impossible to fire a bad teacher who's not performing. Almost impossible. But in charter schools, if a teacher's not performing and assuming that they're not a union school, you can dismiss a teacher by not renewing their contract at the end of the year. You can tell the teacher, look, we have certain standards that you need to fulfill. You're just not fulfilling them. Having worked in private school education at the high school level for a vast majority of my career, I've witnessed that on multiple occasions where we had counselors, we had teachers who were not performing. So from one year to the next, the administration had the ability to say, you know what, we gave this a trial run. You met with your dean on multiple occasions to correct whatever deficiencies you had. You didn't really address them. You didn't really correct them. So we're going to have to part ways. We're not going to be renewing your contract. I want to go a step further with this. Think about why school districts or unions are opposed to public charter schools outside the union membership perspective. For every student that goes from a traditional public school to now a public charter school, that's one less student sitting in a seat, which means less money that district's going to receive for the students there that attend that district. It comes down to dollars. See, we might hide behind the facade of, well, we don't know about accountability. Well, guess what? We don't know about accountability at private schools. We don't know about accountability at public schools, traditional public schools. So yes, it's a valid concern, but we're not holding everyone accountable. It comes down to dollars and funding. Now, do I think we need to fund our traditional public schools? Certainly, a lot better than we are right now. But at the same time, we also have to explore what is in the best interest of the student. If the student is going to a school in their community that is overpopulated, they're going to a school in their community that doesn't have the books that are necessary. They're going to school in their community where teachers are known to go because it's an easy ride. They're not required to do much. Then it's not the best interest of that student or that family to remain there. And then you have schools like KIPP charter schools that are popping up throughout low-income areas, providing, in my opinion, from what I've witnessed, a phenomenal educational experience. Children are learning. The needs of children are being addressed. Now, does that mean by every instructor, for every teacher? Not necessarily. But I want you to think about how public charter schools have given a wake-up call to the traditional public education system. So we'll continue with this discussion later on, but I'm going to go back to sharing my screen so that we can continue to go through the numbers. So if I'm someone who is opposed to public charter schools, and as I mentioned before, I'm not opposed to them, look at this chart here showing the rise over the years. Parents are demanding more. Parents are saying, how is it that my son or my daughter goes to this traditional public school that has 1,500 students, yet my niece or nephew can go to this public charter school that has 700, where teachers actually know my kid's name, where teachers are able to identify the struggles of my students, of my children. So I want you to think about this. As these numbers climb, if I'm a school district, I'm freaking out. Because although school district funds are going to public charter schools, they are not going to traditional public schools if charter school enrollment's increasing. Let's look at this. This is by percentage of the population, not by, there's only 8 charter schools in Nevada. No. 8% of charter schools, I'm sorry, of schools, public schools in Nevada are public charter schools. California, 10%, Arizona, 17%, right? Texas, 6%. The national average is about 6% of public schools in each state are public charter schools. And it's going to continue to increase. We look at enrollments. Initially, when charter schools came about, they had a fairly large white population. But we fast forward to 2016 and we start seeing the white population decrease, and we start to see some decreases in the African American population. But where we see a significant increase is in the Latino Hispanic population within charter schools. One of the things I find interesting about some of the larger public charter schools is they'll actually map a student from the point of entrance, let's say at kindergarten or first grade, all the way to college graduation. They'll provide the resources throughout that student's high school experience to ensure that that student is college bound. That's not something that's difficult to do. To make sure that students are college bound is not difficult to do. But it's about holding each other accountable. It's about creating a culture of academic excellence. It's providing students with the resources and the support that they need in order to succeed. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. As I mentioned before, the number of students in traditional public schools has been on a steady decline. While in the state of California, the number of students attending public charter schools has continued to rise. We see roughly a 0.8% decline in the number of students in California who are enrolled in traditional public schools. From 2014 to 2019, statewide student enrollment in traditional public schools declined from about 6.2 to 6.19 million. So not a huge drop, but still significant in that it pulls away money from traditional public schools. Public charter school growth that was experienced went from 544,000 to 652,000. Essentially, we saw about 11% increase statewide of public charter school enrollment. What we want to understand about the California public education system is that about 61% of all public school students identify as low income and qualify for free or reduced lunch. California has one of the highest rates of youth poverty. California has one of the highest rates of English language learners. Yet we also experience one of the lowest rates of funding per student. And so I want you to think about that. And as you're thinking about that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a moment. And what we're going to look at is a map of the United States that shows how each state is funding their schools. And so that's loading right now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to hover around above the map so that you're able to see specifically what each school is doing with what each state is doing as far as funding students. So let me go back to share screen. And so the national average that is spent on each student, or we call that per pupil, is about $12,526. And so when we look at these numbers, we look at California at about $9,400. We look at Montana at about just under $14,000. We look at Maine at about just under 16,000. And we look at the state of Utah, which is about 7,200. So Utah actually has the lowest per pupil funding, while Alaska and Vermont have some of the highest. Look at Texas, $8,400. Alaska, as I mentioned before, Florida, $9,700. One of the great debates that takes place within education is whether or not throwing more money at the education system solves problems. And that's a complicated concept. That's a complicated idea. Does money solve all issues? And the answer is no, not exactly. Because we've seen a considerable amount of poor management within school districts. We've seen a lot of wasteful spending within school districts. We see money being shared unfairly between school districts. That the schools that need the most support may not necessarily be getting that support. We see situations where the issues faced by students as they create complications for how a student performs in school are issues that exist far beyond the classroom. Think about a student who goes hungry every night. There are only two meals during the day, are breakfast at school and lunch at school. And in order to eat, the student needs to wait till the following morning. Think about situations where you have a student who is living in a household with perhaps multiple families. Let's relate it to today, to the college experience. And we can relate this also to the K-12 experience. Think about how many students, if it's at Rio Hondo College or LA Harbor College, are going to school in an online learning environment without the tools that can contribute to academic success and make your lives a lot easier. Consistent internet access, a laptop, a tablet, ebooks. Think about how our education experience during this quarantine has further highlighted many of the known inequities that have existed in our education system. It's highlighted it in so many ways. Think about this. In our K-12 system, those students who are low income, those students who are living in poverty, may have been able to not have that poverty, the low income status acknowledged in schools. Or perhaps the kid didn't acknowledge it themselves because they don't have a true understanding of money at a very, very young age. But then we get to this online instruction. And now students are saying, well, why don't we have internet? Why don't I have a tablet? Why don't I have a laptop? Well, that stuff's not cheap. And yes, school districts have attempted to provide those resources, and they had a very short period of time to provide those resources. But think about How many of our students today, we have a whole entire summer, 3 months where we could have continued to tackle this problem. And there are still students who don't have the resources going into the fall. I want to take this to community colleges, even though we're looking at K-12 education. In my opinion, it infuriates me to know that when we were giving out laptops as a district to students, when we were giving out laptops at individual colleges, we may have a population of 5,000, but we only had 300 laptops to give out. How is that fair? How is that equitable? How is that fulfilling the mission of the college? Education has the ability to be that equalizing force within our society. Yet the needs of our students are being highlighted in this point of crisis, and we haven't stepped up to the plate. Think about how many of your fellow classmates, perhaps even including yourself, are attempting to take online classes on a cell phone, attempting to write essays on a cell phone, attempting to take quizzes or exams on a cell phone, and how difficult that can be. As educators, we need to do better. As individual institutions, we need to do better. As school districts, we need to do better because we are failing our students during this time of crisis. Let's go back to K-12 education. In California, 19% of public school students are English language learners. 55% are Latino Hispanic, 23% are white, 6% are African American. This is within the state of California. But let me ask you this question. Does our curriculum in our schools, and this is not exclusive to public schools, does our curriculum reflect the populations that we teach? The answer is no. Our stories are neglected. Our stories are forgotten. And what I mean by our stories, the stories of racial and ethnic minority communities, the stories of those who are living in poverty, women, the LGBTQ community. Our stories are neglected. Our stories are ignored in history books. And then people wonder, why can't students relate to what they're being taught? Because they don't see themselves in those books. Now let's look at high school graduation rates. And according to the National Center for Education Statistics, the average graduation rate across the United States was roughly about 85%. The state of Iowa had the highest graduation rate at 91%. The state of New Mexico at 71%. California has a graduation rate of 83%. When we break down graduation rates by race and ethnicity, 89% of white students graduate, 78% of African Americans, 80% of Latinos, 91% of Asian Pacific Islanders, and 72% of American Indian, Alaska Native graduate in the United States with a high school diploma. Now, as a former high school educator who was the director of admissions, who was director of financial aid, who was a counselor for freshmen, who was a counselor for college students, who was a teacher as well, I can tell you that despite these high graduation rates, what we also know is that students are not graduating necessarily college ready. And that should raise a red flag. That students may not have the academic knowledge to immediately qualify for college algebra, to immediately qualify for English 101. Students may struggle And people are quick to blame the victim. People are quick to blame the students for those struggles. And I oftentimes tell individuals, you're blaming the wrong person or people. That when we look at the struggles of students, at some point in their education experience, in their educational careers, the student began to struggle in math. Yet that struggle was not effectively addressed by the educators that were teaching them. Think about how many of us despise mathematics. I'm one of those people. The minute I see a math problem, and let's go a step further, I despise science as well. Not that I don't believe the science community, I believe the science community, but I myself, when it comes to academics, I'm not a fan of science. I've always struggled in it. And we develop this fixed mindset. So we go into a math class, we go into a science class, and because we've struggled throughout our academic careers, now we're in college, and now we're sitting in that class saying, I'm not going to be good at it. And we immediately sign ourselves off. We dismiss ourselves from even excelling in those classes. Well, think about that. Think about how many of our challenges at the college level could have been addressed or alleviated earlier on in our careers. Here's some more information about high school graduation rates. And what we see here, as I mentioned before, this idea of college readiness. Well, how do we determine a student's level of college readiness? Unfortunately, through standardized exams. And if you're like me, when it comes to standardized exams, you might be a horrible test taker. I know I am. I got like an 1150, no, like a 1050 on my SAT out of 1600. That's an okay score, but that's not a great score. I remember conversing with one of my counselors in high school, and the counselor told me, you might get through community college, but the chances of you graduating college are very slim. That's what I was told by one of my counselors while I was in high school, because my SAT score wasn't that great, and I was like a 3.3 student. Well, first off, that's a horrible counselor, because a counselor shouldn't be saying that to a student. A counselor should be there to say, look, these are the colleges you qualify for. Let's find the right college fit for you. But remember, educators can do a considerable amount of damage when they don't encourage students. When they say, hey, you know what, you may not qualify for that school, but let me empower you by showing you how you're going to get to that college. It might not be immediately after high school graduation, but you may be able to transfer in. You may be able to go there for a graduate degree. That's the role of a counselor. And we can have a whole conversation. We're going to have a whole class on counseling in K-12 education and how to be a good counselor. But that's a discussion for another day. So where do standardized exams typically assess students? English, mathematics, reading, science, right? According to the ACT, which is a standardized exam, 38% of students who took the ACT were only 38% were able to reach a benchmark score in 3 of the 4 subject areas, meaning that they were proficient only in 75% of the areas being assessed. Only 38%. 35% of the students who took the ACT were not able to score a benchmark score in any of these subject areas, meaning that they were not proficient in English, they were not proficient in mathematics, they were not proficient in reading, and they were not proficient in science. Now, this begs the question, was it that the students didn't have the knowledge, or was it that they had exam anxiety? The ACT is similar to the SAT. Students freak out, our brains shut down, and we struggle. So I'm always cautious about any information that I gather from standardized exams. According to the National Center for Public Policy and Higher Education, 40 to 60% of first-year college students require remediation in English, math, or both subject areas. Now, there's nothing wrong with remedial education. I converse with students often, and students come to me and they express their frustration. Hey, I'm taking this math class. I started 3 levels below. I'm taking this English class. I started 2 levels below. And I tell students, don't view that as a negative. View that as an instrument to strengthen your academic performance, because when you get to grad school, you have a ton of writing. Address the problems early on so it makes your life easier later on as you're trying to complete all these assignments. Now, remedial courses to college students can be frustrating because it can delay graduation. So we only plan to be at Rio Hondo, we only plan to be at LA Harbor for 2 years, but now we have to be there for 2.5 years, or we were planning to have our summers off, but now we have to take summer classes. It also can contribute to student attrition, meaning student progress from one semester to the next, right? Students may get frustrated, they may drop out. And so we see the on-time completion rates. Students who are saying, okay, I'm entering school in the fall of 2020, I'll be done by the spring of 2022. Only about 10% of students who are required to take remedial courses will graduate on time, will graduate from a community college, for example, within a 2-year period. Most will spend 2.5 to 3 years at that community college. We look at proficiency rates. For African Americans, it's 32% in English. Latino Hispanics is 46%. Asian Americans, 77%. Whites, 72%. Look at mathematics. Look at reading. Look at science. Think about it. If you cannot read at the appropriate grade level, it's frustrating. Now you're going to a college environment where you're reading all these academic journals, and even with a doctorate and 2 master's degrees, there's times where I'm scratching my head reading these academic journals saying, what the hell is this person saying? Sometimes I have to have a thesaurus or a dictionary with me because some of the words, I have no clue what those words are. And that's with what? 3, 4, 7, 11, 12 years? Maybe 12 years of higher ed experience as a student? Now imagine being a student fresh out of high school and struggling with this. It could be an infuriating experience. It could lead to someone saying, you know what, I just can't do it. We look at college readiness. Lower income, ethnic and racial minority students have higher rates of remedial education enrollment as opposed to the white higher income peers. In public community colleges, 78% of African American students, 75% of Latino Hispanic students, 64% of white college students, 76% of low income students are in remedial education. 66% of African American college students at the 4-year level, 53% of Latino Hispanic students at the 4-year level, 36% of white students, and 52% of low income college students at the 4-year level are in remedial courses. 80% of first-year college students take at least one developmental or remedial course in math, English, or both. 65% of first-year college students enroll in mathematics. 54% of first-year college students enroll in English. 73% of first-year college students enrolled in a mathematics remedial course begin the sequence of classes 2 levels below college level. Now, once again, this is not there to deter individuals. This is there as a tool to help build you up. But I can certainly understand the frustration that students are going through. As I mentioned before, there is an overrepresentation of low-income students. There's overrepresentation of Latino, Hispanic, or African American students in these remedial courses. We look at high rates of attrition once again. Students not progressing from one semester to the next. 44% of college students enrolled in developmental or remedial math classes complete the sequence. 60% of college students enrolled in developmental or remedial English classes complete the sequence. 17% of college students who start 4 levels below college level mathematics complete the sequence. 31% of college students who start 4 levels below college level English complete the sequence. 16% of developmental remedial education students earn an associate's degree within a 6-year period. Only 24% of students in remedial education successfully transfer to a 4-year college or university. This is appalling in so many ways, and I do not blame the students. I blame K-12 education. I blame community colleges that do not offer the support and the resources to students. How are we going to say that we are an institution of higher ed, an institution dedicated to equity and equality, an institution dedicated to student success, yet have these numbers? We need to understand the struggles that students face. We need to, as community colleges or local 4-year universities, work with our local school districts and say, let's work together, let's collaborate to strengthen the educational experience of students here, because if they do well in K-12 education, there's a high probability that they're going to do well in post-secondary education. And then we're going to have a whole bunch of kids graduating with college degrees and coming back to these communities and having a positive impact on these communities. But we're not doing that as a whole. We're doing that as individual institutions at times. In my opinion, one of the biggest scams in American public schools is this topic of tracking students, where students are divided into classes based on their overall achievement. This idea that students are marked as above average or below average, or just at the right spot, and then they're divided into classes based on their achievement level, because the idea behind it was to address the academic needs of students. To say, okay, you're struggling, so let me give you additional assistance. Well, guess what? That additional assistance rarely showed up. And so now you're a student who's struggling, and guess what? You're placed on the below average track for majority of your academic career. It's evolved into a system of segregation within our American public education system. And low income English language learners, ethnic and racial minorities are overwhelmingly placed in a tracking system that identifies them as below average. Think about the type of resources and opportunities that are afforded to students who are considered college bound or above average. And then think about the resources and the services that are provided to students who are identified below average. I always tell my students this. I break it up into 3 categories when I'm looking at tracking within schools. I break it up into your college bound, your maybe college bound, and we're just trying to keep you here till 16, because legally you're only required to go to school till you're 16 years old. Those students who are tracked into that category, at least through my interpretation of let's just keep you here at 16, they're not going to have access to the best resources. They're very rarely going to meet with the counselors. I want you to think about this, and I'm going to exit the screen real quick. How many of us, how many of us have an experience within our high school years where we met with our counselors more than, let's say, 5 times throughout the whole academic year? Did anyone meet with their counselors, and you can just mark yes or no, more than 5 times throughout their high school experience? Now, let me ask you another question. Just write a yes or no here, too. Is there anyone in this group that did not meet with their counselor at all throughout their high school career, or at least during their senior year? So there's a mixture of responses here. I understand the challenges that counselors face. You have 750 students, there's only one of you. I understand that they have other responsibilities that they need to fulfill. And this is where my research on my dissertation comes into play. This is where my experience as a counselor comes into play. Right? There are too many counselors engaged in what we call inappropriate job duties. And not that they're doing anything wrong, it's just that they may be an attendance officer, they may be handling disciplinary issues, they may be handling a wide variety of things unrelated to actually meeting with students and counseling students. But there's absolutely no reason why students cannot have access to their counselors. The counselor should be the person that's on the campus the latest. In my opinion, at least that's what I did. I was on campus at times from till 5, 6, 6:30 at night, meeting with students. Granted, my school is significantly smaller, but still 97% of my students went to four-year universities. 100% of my students went to college. But if you ask my students, I made contact with each one of my seniors as a whole nearly every single day. Even if it was just visiting one of the classes for seniors, or actually multiple classrooms, I would make sure that they saw me every day and I would provide them updates or encourage them to come see me, whatever it may be. Students need to know that you're engaged. And students need to know that, hey, you may be struggling as a student, but you know what? You're really good at math. You may be struggling as a student, but you're really good in history. So let's try to get you into AP US history. Let's try to get you into AP government. So you got to provide students with an opportunity, because although they may be struggling in one subject and not the other, right, just by giving them that little push can really boost their self-confidence. Giving students that opportunity to take an honors class or an AP class can carry a tremendous amount of weight and lead to a positive experience for that student. See, when tracking is done correctly, it allows the teacher to cater to the needs of the students by individualizing instruction for low or normal achievement students. It allows students to receive very targeted instruction. Targeted instruction hopefully leads to stronger academic performance, which can increase a student's self-esteem, right? And there is a correlation or relationship between self-esteem and academic achievement. That's when it's done correctly. But what we've seen, as I mentioned before, is a system of segregation. I mentioned before, lower income students, ethnic and racial minority students are more likely to be at the lower levels of the track. The self-fulfilling prophecy comes into play. Students being labeled as members of the lower tracks may have decreased academic performance, may have lower levels of self-esteem. And many times students get trapped into these tracks their entire academic career. The idea is that some teachers may have lower expectations for the lower track students. Look, as a counselor, I knew who were my all-stars academically, and I knew who my students were who were struggling. But I'll tell you this, every single one of my students, every single one of them, who was in the 2.0 to 2.5 range, every single one of those students went to a 4-year university. Every single one of those students was admitted to at least 4 4-year universities. Because I didn't give up on them. I told my students, I'm going to kick your ass all year, not literally, figuratively, until you bring me 4 acceptances. I will not let you cross that stage unless you have a 4-year college offer. I want to paint a picture for you. I had a student who had a 2.7 GPA. 2.7, a B minus C plus GPA. I worked with him actually since he was a freshman. And then I wasn't his counselor sophomore, junior year, and then I was his counselor again senior year. He had over 18 college acceptances, including Fordham University in New York, which is a phenomenal university, and received over $500,000 in scholarships. See, what happens in the field of counseling, and I relate counseling to tracking students because there is a correlation there at times. When I would go to counseling conventions or, have discussions with counselors, they'd tell me, oh, my student's going to Stanford, my student's going to Harvard, my student's going to all these schools, because they always talk about the top, 5% of students. And I would ask counselors, I would tell counselors, it's not about what you do for your top students, it's what you do for the bottom 25% that defines you as a counselor. But schools have done the complete opposite. Schools are not concerned at times with the lowest performing students. They just want you to not be their problem anymore. We need to change that attitude in K-12 education. We need everyone to understand that, yes, this student may not necessarily have a desire to go get a 4-year university degree. But perhaps the student wants to go on to become an electrician. Perhaps the student wants to learn how to become a mechanic. Perhaps the student wants to learn how to do plumbing, whatever it may be. There's a program for that, and it's your job as an institution to provide the student with the skills and the knowledge to go pursue those programs. By the time a student completes their high school education, they should have somewhat of a roadmap laid out for them by the institution that they went to for high school. All right, so that concludes our discussion on Chapter 16 notes for education.